What is a renovation? Well, it's a bit of a controversial practice where landlords evict tenants under the pretext of needing to perform a major, that's a key word there, a major renovation on the property. And the term renoviction is a blend of renovation and eviction, renoviction.
So, typically, a proper renovation would occur when the property owner wants to upgrade their building to make the living situation better for the existing tenant, or because they are going through a capex program and they're maybe trying to get economies of scale, or for whatever reason they would want to renovate the unit. In a lot of cases, there's this sort of ulterior motive, which is to attract higher paying tenants. But in most jurisdictions, you have to actually offer the unit back to the original tenant, who's being displaced by the renovation process, or perhaps to sell the property at a higher value. After the renovations, the units are often re-rented at significantly higher rates, which would either price out the original tenants or would be considered a bad faith move because it violates what is allowable within the renovation program. And that's kind of where it becomes this. Like, I don't think anybody uses the renoviction word to talk about proper, above board or good faith evictions for the purpose of renovation and returning the existing tenant.
Yeah, for sure, Dan. It definitely has a bit of a negative connotation, and this practice has become contentious in many urban areas across the country, especially those that are experiencing rapid gentrification, mixed with a combination of housing shortages. So that is a lot of Canada at this point. And while property owners argue it's necessary for maintaining and improving housing stock, which it is, critics view it as a loophole to circumvent tenant protections and contribute to housing insecurity. So there's that double-edged sword we were talking about.
So who's right here? Our goal is to kind of try and see if there's a middle ground or find out who might be right. Renovictions have been a hot button issue in Canadian housing, and it's recently really coming to a head because municipalities are now stepping up to regulate it.
Yeah, which honestly doesn't make a ton of sense at face value since landlord tenant rules are technically provincial jurisdiction. Right here in Ontario, we've got the Landlord and Tenant Board, but that's just in Ontario. There's different operational boards that run every different province.
And yet here we are. So we're going to go through the timelines of how we got here and the headlines to better understand this.
Okay, so let's start off. Let's rewind and go back in time to 2019. We're in New Westminster, British Columbia, and for the past few years, they've been receiving numerous complaints regarding renovictions.
So on May 27th, 2019, in response, the City Council amended the business regulations and licensing bylaw to include Part 6, a section that specifically aimed to deter renovictions and to provide protection to those tenants who may be displaced by large-scale renovations.
Now, landlords who violated that bylaw could be fined up to $1,000 per day and lose their business license.
So landlords who wanted to evict for repairs still had to apply to the city and prove the renovations were necessary.
The municipality claims the bylaw was successful in reducing the number of reported renovictions, but it also withstood two court challenges.
So almost immediately, the legislation was appealed by a numbered company, 1193652 BC Limited versus New Westminster. This is a court case that I'm referencing, where the appellant landlord argued that the bylaw amendments were beyond the jurisdiction of the city, since the provincial legislature intended to exhaustively regulate rent control and evictions under the Act. According to a great note written in 2021 by a Kelsey Stuckert of Civil Legal LLP of BC.
So the landlord sought to have all of the units vacant for at least a year to complete renovations and did not request an exemption. Further, the landlord did not provide alternative accommodation for those tenants that had to vacate, and both Chambers judge and the Court of Appeal disagreed and held that the community charter authorized the city to regulate renovations locally, stating that the bylaw amendments had the lawful purpose of protecting renters.
So basically, they determined the city had the authority to do this pursuant to its powers to regulate businesses. Remember, we talk about real estate in this show as a business. You're running a business, and you have to, you're starting to see rental licenses required in different municipalities, et cetera. I mean, like, it's not uncommon for different businesses to require licenses, as well as the health and safety or protection of persons or properties in relation to residential property within their municipal jurisdiction.
Now, that bylaw that we're talking about was eventually repealed by the British Columbia government, enacted similar legislation province wide.
So a few years later, a report in the Toronto Star in 2021 stated that according to city statistics, renovictions went from a combined 333 households between 2016 and 2018 to zero since 2019 when the bylaw came into force. So obviously it is actually having an impact on reducing, again, these renovictions would be your bad faith renoviction. It's not saying that tenants were no longer evicted or displaced during the renovation period for legal and above board and proper renovation processes, but illegal renovictions basically dropped 100%.
Yeah, now we're going to continue to fast forward to almost present day, 2024, where a similar wave of policy seems to be moving across the province of Ontario.
Hamilton passed a renoviction bylaw in April of 2024, which will be enforced starting in January of 2025. Landlords must obtain a renovation license, provide relocation assistance, and allow tenants to return after renovations, which isn't new. That is provincial code anyways.
And a few months after Hamilton passed this law, Toronto adopted a renovation law bylaw in June of 2024 as part of the Housing TO 2020 to 2030 action plan. The bylaw regulates the legal processes that landlords must follow when evicting tenants for renovations.
Through Toronto's new bylaw, landlords issuing an N13 notice to end a tenancy will require a rental renovation license, similar to New Westminster. To apply for the license, landlords need to get building permits, provide a copy of the N13 notice to end a tenancy, and submit, this is the part that kind of annoys me because it is inflationary and it's a money grab, a $700 application fee, which is waived for multi-tenant housing operators. So it's impacting your smaller landlords, basically.
It's a nice hefty fee. They also must notify tenants of a license application after submission and advise on how to obtain information on eviction prevention and the rental renovations license bylaw. So you've got to go in and actually kind of work against yourself if you are a landlord trying to do this and provide all the information to your tenants to essentially say no or provide them the legal and information they need to fight back. You also must post tenant information notices in the building advising tenants of the license application so they can likely prepare for the incoming vacating of that property, and provide a report prepared by a qualified person noting that the renovation requires vacant possession. Dan, who would that qualified person be?
I guess it would be like a building inspector, a contractor. I don't know. That's interesting. I mean, there's probably an industry opportunity evolving there, to be honest. They must complete a tenant accommodation and compensation plan to provide tenants who choose to return to their to the units with a temporary compatible housing at similar rents, or provide monthly rent gap payments based on post 2015 average market rents to cover the rent difference with tenants finding their own temporary housing, and provide moving allowances of $1,500 for a studio 1-bedroom unit or $2,500 for a 2 or more bedroom unit. Like, so you're literally like, again, I actually like, I get this. It all makes sense to me, but it does make the whole process significantly more expensive. But they're basically just putting it together a more methodical way for landlords to actually follow rules that technically already exist within these Ontario legislature.
Yeah, the last thing they must do is provide tenants with a prescribed severance compensation where the tenant chooses not to return to the unit after the renovation or that extensive repair work is completed.
Yeah, and again, this is all kind of in line with Ontario's LTB rules anyways, I think, where you have to provide monthly 1 month compensation, I believe anyways, or minimum of 1 month compensation. It could be more if there's displacements, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, and if we look even more recently to London, Ontario, they've approved the development of a renoviction bylaw in September of 2024, requiring landlords to apply for a rental unit repair license and provide tenant information packages within 7 days of issuing an eviction notice.
Ottawa, similar, in August of 2024, City Council voted to explore feasibility of a renoviction bylaw to protect tenants from unjust evictions due to renovations.
And in St. Catharines, the city is exploring the possibility of implementing an anti-renovation bylaw inspired by Hamilton's recent legislations to safeguard tenants from displacements due to said renovations.
So this hasn't yet been enforced or appealed in Ontario yet, which is an important part of the process from my perspective, similar to like what we mentioned took place in BC. So we don't really know if this will end up surviving the provincial courts. And when it does end up, I would say probably it's very likely to end up getting appealed in Ontario, like similar to what happened in BC with the two landlord cases. So I think that's probably also a very important next thing in the timeline to watch for.
Yeah, and there's some framework from New Westminster's bylaw, a lot of which is pretty common, where there is a renoviction restriction. Sorry, wow, that's a bit of a mouthful there.
Yeah, we call those renostrictions where I'm from.
Good one.
Is that a new one? I love it. That we got to coin that one before it gets before it spreads like wildfire on Twitter. Restrictions. Remember, we heard it first. So restrictions on evictions for renovations or repairs.
Yeah, so
I
that's
say that nice and slow because I couldn't.
That's their act. Restrictions on eviction sounds like you're about to drop like a real estate Dr. Seuss book over here.
Are we working on that?
Something like that.
Okay, so owners cannot require tenants to vacate for renovations or repairs unless all necessary permits, including like building permits, plumbing, electrical development, are all obtained. And the tenant is either offered a new tenancy agreement for a comparable or better unit, or they are provided temporary accommodation with a plan for returning them to that original unit which they vacated.
Yeah, so that's again New Westminster's Dr. Seuss act, that restrictions thing, but similar, I would say, in spirit to Toronto, London, Hamilton, St. Catharines, etc. So we can probably use all of these as a case study for what could happen if your province or city starts regulating renovictions.
So we started the episode off speaking about our personal experiences and tenants facing evictions. But what about the other side of the story, Dan?
When we acquired this 12-unit building for $1.2 million, the rents were 40% below market. 18 months later, after our value-add strategy, the property appraised for over $2 million.
Was that your like real estate private equity Chad voice? Did you just put on a Patagonia vest and
I threw on a Patagucci. I got props in the studio here, literally running real tools for that soundbite. Sorry if I blew your ears. So yes, it was. And the reason I did my Chad voice is because as a homeowner, I'm going to be talking about all the good things about renovictions. And actually, to discount here, renovictions being an operative word, but the process, or the reason that we might need to evict people for renovations, let's call it.
Yes. Okay. So, Dan, you are the homeowner, and I'm a landlord, similar to you, Dan, but I am also a tenant, right? I rent where I live. So I guess that means I'm going to talk about all the bad things about renovictions.
Okay. Well, here we go. Let's touch gloves and come out fighting.
Are you trying to bait me into making like a Mike Tyson, Jake Paul reference here? Because I'm not going to do it.
No, I promise to anyone listening, this fight will be far more exciting than that fight. And
and real.
Yeah.
Okay.
Both of us are in our 30s. So.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's dive into some of the primary arguments against renovictions. Okay, so first one is displacement of long-term residents. That's a pretty obvious one. Renovictions force out established community members, disrupting social networks, neighborhood stability, and people's lives in general, right? There's increased housing insecurity where those tenants face uncertainty and usually a lot of stress when they're forced to find new housing, and it often is in less affordable areas. It also is a gentrification acceleration, right? So renovictions can speed up neighborhood gentrification, pricing out legacy lower income residents or incoming lower income residents. We also witness a loss of affordable housing stock when units are renovated and re-rented at higher rates. It reduces the overall affordability of over the overall availability of that affordable housing. There's also a disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. Think about elderly people, low income, and marginalized communities that are often hit the hardest by the practice of renovictions. And then, of course, there's potential for abuse where we see some bad apple landlords that may use this tactic of renovations as a pretext for evicting tenants when the actual renovations they need to do are minimal or even in some cases unnecessary, right? And then, of course, there's the main thing, which is the disruption of tenants' lives. They're forced to move, which can impact employment, children's education or school districts, access to local services and support systems. And Dan, as we said in the top of the show, you and I have both been asked for consulting on a lot of these things. And when I was providing people with steps to do or things to look up or, providing advice, there was a lot of stress, right? People did have to go through all the things that I just mentioned. So these arguments that I just made from the tenant side of things highlight the social and economic costs of renovictions on individuals and their surrounding communities. Now, Patagonia, Chad, let's hear it from your side of things.
Yeah, so let's explore some arguments that proponents of, again, I'm reluctant to use the word renovictions because I think that's the
it's just a bad word. Yeah.
It's like it's the critical word. But proponents of why we should be able to evict people for the purpose of renovating. So the first one would be property rights, right? Owners argue they should have the freedom to improve and maximize the value of their investments, but also just like, they own the thing. So the libertarian in me wants to agree and say people should be allowed to do what they want with their property. After all, it is theirs.
But the same libertarian would probably also argue that the tenant should be able to do whatever they want as well, such as resist the renoviction.
Touche. Honestly, I think the libertarian perspective against renovictions might argue that technically contractual property rights extend to tenants once a lease is signed, right? I mean, that's how the law works. It's like, a commercial tenant can fully renovate space. So lease terms should be negotiated freely between parties, including provisions for renovations and maybe not get the state involved per se.
Yeah, so I guess if that's the line of communication that we're going off of, the tenant, in theory, would also be free to resist an eviction, request a cash for keys or something of that nature, which is becoming a common theme in today's market for landlords. I remember when that was kind of a secret term for landlords, right? Cash for keys. Now it's wide out in the open.
Yeah, the challenge with that I have is that, a free market technically should naturally balance landlord tenant interests without government intervention. But I think the free market is limited by, at least in Ontario, and I would say in most jurisdictions, the landlord and tenant protection system, the board, being really slow, for example. So a tenant could say no, and the landlord would have no recourse for like 10 to 12 months until they get an LTB hearing. And that opens the door for a lot of abuse to take place.
Yeah, for
on
sure.
On either side, by the way. I'm not saying because there are bad, there are bad examples on both sides for sure.
100%. And this is also why tenants have the ability to request cash for keys or stop paying rent. So going back to your free market comment, Dan, it's not really a free market at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, it's free, I guess, because like the
it's free if you stop paying rent, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's a free market in such that eventually it arrives at a resolution, but it's delayed significantly by these inefficiencies. So there are more reasons why I think that renovation is a positive thing that I want to get to, but I first want to consider them sort of in the context of how rent controls of all forms can be considered negative. Thomas Sowell, who's one of my favorite economists, mentions in his book Basic Economics, I imagine you can guess what that one is about, that rent control often has unintended negative consequences. He points out that while rent control may seem beneficial in the short term by keeping rents artificially low, it can also lead to housing shortages, which we have in Canada, and we have rent control in Canada. Landlords have less incentive to build and maintain rental properties. And obviously the limitation on renovations would exacerbate this, especially if they're limited to being legally being able to legally remove tenants to renovate the property, or increasing the cost of doing so, right? Which would lower the net benefit of doing so. You could see a deterioration of existing housing with reduced income or a higher cost to renovate. Landlords might neglect repairs or maintenance. You could see an inefficient allocation of housing. People, you see this a lot, to be honest with you. People may hold on to rent controlled apartments even when they no longer need them, right? Or stay in a unit even if they need to move because they can't. The cost is so cheap. Like, you hear about this a lot in New York, right? Where they have like the rent control systems, where you have people whose rent are like stuck in like the 70s, right? And you could be in the same building as somebody, and your rent would be like 4 or 5 times the place next door.
Yeah,
so that would be
there's crazy stories. People, the old timers that started renting in, maybe around our age, Dan, early 30s kind of thing, that are paying literally hundreds of dollars, not thousands, hundreds of dollars. And the guy 2 floors up who just moved in to a new unit is paying 10,000.
Yeah, and like, because that person doesn't have to participate in today's market, they, I'm sure that individual probably, if you look and live in Manhattan even today, setting rent aside, probably could buy a house maybe in the suburbs or something like that, but they choose not to because they have like the best housing situation that somebody possibly could, but that limits the ability for somebody else to consume that unit, right? And then I think the one other piece of that is that you get these like black markets that are potential to form. You saw this a lot in Canada with Airbnb arbitrage, right? So like basically people would rent a unit and then they would sublet it. They would either sublet it to, like there's a lot of people doing this with student rentals as well. You could go rent a unit. So tenants doing like sublet arbitrage, or landlords actually just breaking the rules, which is kind of the whole topic here, right? Landlords breaking the rules to compensate for lost income. And those would both be like black market forces. These are all things that you can see happening in Canada's market, and they are negative externalities from rent control. Sowell concluded that rent control often ends up harming the very people it's intended to help by reducing the quality and quantity of available housing in the long run. And I guess expanding on that context, it is important to note that renoviction limits are more a form of vacancy decontrol than rent control, right? So let's just quickly break down the difference between vacancy decontrol and rent control. I know I'm getting away from our argument here. I'm not scared of you. I just want to explain things properly.
That's right. I will go from my role as a tenant to my role as dictionary, and I'll switch back over. So rent control, this policy basically limits how much a landlord can either increase rent for existing tenants, typically tying increases to inflation or a set percentage like we have here in Ontario, Dan, at 2.5%. And it applies continuously even as tenants change, even as that unit turns over. Whereas vacancy decontrol prevents landlords from vacating properties to reset rent to market rents when a unit becomes vacant. So once a new tenant moves in, rent control may apply again until the next vacancy.
So renoviction limits operate more similarly to vacancy decontrol by allowing landlords to increase rents after renovations, but with additional protections for existing tenants. Now, again, in most jurisdictions in Canada, the landlord can't actually increase the rent after a renovation to the existing tenant. And let's call that the national standard. It's give or take. I think there's like a couple of jurisdictions where it's a bit different, but basically tenant has to be given the opportunity to consume that original unit at the same rate. So like that's, it would sound like a smoking deal for the tenant, right? Oh, I get a brand new unit at the same price, but the consequence is I have to move for X period of time to, so there's a displacement that takes place, right? Renovation kind of has these benefits of improving housing stock, stimulating the economy, revitalizing neighborhoods, and keeping the market in equilibrium, and increasing the tax base, which the municipalities want, right? Because every time you do a renovation, it gets reassessed, and then your tax would increase accordingly. So renovations obviously can modernize and upgrade aging buildings. Like I would say, you get you get the complaint about landlords being a-holes for doing renovictions or illegal evictions. But then I would say the other primary complaint you get is landlords not doing enough, right? They didn't fix this thing up, or slumlord, or this or that, right? So it's hard to get both. And it's a difficult kind of thing to balance, right? Renovation projects create jobs and inject money into the local economies. I'd say that's, it's whatever. It's an argument, but it's not. Revitalization of neighborhoods, again, keeping the market in equilibrium and that increased tax base. So I guess what I'm trying to say is affordable housing shouldn't be, let's call it like cheap housing, right? And this is what ends up pushing more people to be slumlords. You can see this in a lot of blue states in the US, right?
Yeah, no, that's it's a great point. And while it's true that many of those blue states have implemented rent control policies, they often still have some of the highest rents in the country. For example, California, New York, Massachusetts, all traditionally blue states consistently rank among the states with the highest median rents. Cities like San Francisco, New York, Boston, which all have strong rent control measures, are also among the most expensive rental markets in America. And the seeming paradox can be attributed to a few different factors. First being high demand in these urban centers where jobs and amenities are concentrated, right? Think about San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. Those are the places people want to live, seemingly, in the United States. They also have limited housing supply due to zoning restrictions and slower development process than you would in, let's say, Middle America or Texas, for instance. And the potential unintended consequences of rent control, such as reduced investment in new rental properties, which you just alluded to, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's kind of just that you have this thing where if a place is likely to have some sort of rent control regulation, they're probably likely to have more regulations on lots of stuff, right? So, like if there's more bureaucracy, it kind of begets more bureaucracy, right? Like that.
Yeah, your permits take longer, the zoning's restricted.
Yeah. It's not to say that any of these things are bad, but the challenge is like the more government state involvement you have, the clunkier the system is, the harder it is for, businesses to do things more freely for better or worse. Right.
Yeah. I mean, we should all know that well, living in Canada here where
for sure.
Yeah, we won't get into that though.
Yeah. So I guess while rent control can provide some stability for tenants, it doesn't necessarily lead to lower overall rents in a city or state. Murtaza Hyder actually did a good article on this, which we've read here before. And speaking of articles, maybe we'll get back to kind of why this is in the news.
Yeah, so great segue, Dan. Let's hop back over to the CBC article about this change. It says that councillors voted 25-1. Bit of a swing there to adopt the bylaw this week, and enforcement starts on July 31st, 2025. But it was a quote from Councillor Diane Sachs that says, I quote, "This bylaw doesn't stop good faith renovations."
So I get why governments are doing this kind of stuff. The system is abused a lot, right? And I do think that bad landlords make the market worse for all of the good landlords in the market. So it really begs the question from my perspective, like, where do you draw the line? What is a good faith versus a bad faith renoviction?